by just following a general protocol. Follow the rules of this protocol that Jim has laid out, which is basically like, do it 2 times a week, do it for a 10-week, this is better, yeah. Do it for a 10-week period, okay, 2 times a week for a 10-week period. Again, journal about it and see what happens. Don't go to work the first time you do it. Like, I'm reading these articles about people or people on these podcasts who are like, it's not a microdose. So B, they're just doing it and going to work, and it's the first time they tried it, and then they start tripping out, and they're like, what happened? Well, you did it, and you went to work the first time. So if you're gonna do it, like, do it on a day off, ideally. Do it on a day that you don't have any plans, on a day that maybe you can go hiking, and that if you take a little bit too much, you can handle it, and you're not in a public situation with people who might judge you for having microdose. And that's the third thing. Don't take too much. Start low and titrate up. Again, a lot of the downsides can be mitigated by being conservative and cautious. Finally, don't mix with other substances, at least initially. Obviously, a lot of people are getting involved in microdosing because they want to see a certain outcome. They want to see a certain benefit. And if you're microdosing and also doing other things, drinking alcohol or smoking cannabis or coffee is probably fine, but if you're kind of confusing those two, you might not be able to understand what benefit or outcome that you are noticing. And so those are the 4 downsides. One other thing to be aware of that has come to my attention in the last month or 2 months, there's a guy named, I want to say is Matt Baggett, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, he's done some research with MDMA, and he tweeted at me and has been pretty active on social media as well about these things. And he studied the way that with a lot like high MDMA use, it kicks off the 5-HT2B agonist, and they've noticed that there could be heart valve damage as a result of that. And lysergamides, which LSD I believe it's related to a lysergamide to some degree. Lysergamides have been proven if they're used consistently to create issues with heart valves. And so consistent use could lead to issues with heart valve symptoms. And by consistent use, I don't mean like a protocol of 10 weeks, twice a week, and you go from there. I mean, if you're doing it every day for like 4 or 5 months, that's probably not a good decision. You probably want to scale back a little bit, and you want to be cautious and conservative, again, because we don't have a lot of research on this. We're operating in the dark, and because we have a government that is, still in the 19th century when it comes to these things, we can't ask these questions, and we can't actually have proper information to go off of. So be cautious, be hesitant if you do it. My hypothesis is that microdosing is going to be a tremendous tool to do a couple things. First, to familiarize people with psychedelic use, people who hadn't ever thought about doing it before because they were intimidated by having a challenging experience, a bad trip. They're more willing to try microdosing. I think that's going to be a utility. I think it could also be a utility in just kind of an initial way of getting introduced to some of the benefits that we can see from psychedelic use. But I think long term, it might not be good to do it for like 5 years straight. So just be cautious of that. Be cautious of your use. General protocol isn't going to do much, but you should be cautious for that reason. And that's why I said short term, it's likely fine. Long term, wait for more research to come out. And hopefully, that research comes out sooner rather than later. That's all I hope. And so this is the most interesting part of the talk for me. I'm a guy who likes to think forward. I'm a guy who likes to think in the future. I'm a guy who likes to think of what structures that we can build as a society and world to create a more inclusive, to create a healthier, to create a more holistic society. And so I love this. I love talking about microdosing because it's so interesting. I love getting up and speaking in front of all of you and sharing this message with you because I think it's extremely important. And so I'm some of this enthusiasm might come out in what I say, and I hope that you can connect with that, and I hope that you understand where I'm coming from. So first, why is microdosing becoming such a big thing? It's because, sorry, go back, that's my bad. No, this is good. Yeah, two more. There we go. Okay, so why microdosing? One, it's a new paradigm of psychedelic use. In the past, psychedelic use has been very binary. Black, white. You either take a bunch, or you don't take any at all. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Two, microdosing is acting as a bridge between the psychedelic fringe and the mainstream. And I'll talk about why that is in a little bit. Three, and I already kind of emphasized this, it works. Something's going on, people are talking about it, people are sharing their message, people are sharing their stories, and in the age of the internet, that's easier than it ever has been before, and this is why it's growing like wildfire. I think that's the most important thing to emphasize, is it's working for people, and that's why it's taking off in popularity. So again, a new paradigm of psychedelic use. In the past, psychedelics have been perceived as, I like the Hunter S. Thompson quote, which is, if you buy the ticket, you take the ride. And that's intimidating for a lot of people, because what if that ride scares the shit out of you? That's hard to deal with. And so a lot of people, they don't want to even touch these things because they're concerned and they're worried and they're intimidated. Or you had people who just, they did it and they went all out. And again, this is largely representative of what we saw in the 60s with people like Ken Kesey and Timothy Leary. But I think up until the past couple of years, in terms of how microdosing has entered this cultural conversation, that's been the perception, is you take a lot or you don't do any at all. There's no middle ground, because there weren't any perceived benefits from being in a middle ground. The people who were doing psychedelics were, following Terence McKenna's advice of taking 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms in a dark room and seeing what happens. And that's interesting, but some people don't want to do that. And so I think, with Jim Fadiman, so Jim published a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. He published it in 2011. He dedicated an entire chapter to microdosing, and he made it very explicitly clear that people were noticing benefits. And again, that was kind of the start, and the way that it took off was Jim was on Tim Ferriss's podcast, and then boom, it really took off after that. So I think that's one reason. Two, this is cool, but it's a bit confusing, so let me do my best to explain it. This is called the Kinefin Framework, and it was a framework that was developed by business leaders to figure out how people can deal with leadership problems and be leaders in a business environment. And so there are 4 squares here. We have complex, we have chaotic, we have complicated, and we have simple. Now, Mike pointed this out to me when we were preparing for this that I didn't notice. All of these share a couple things. All of them share sense and respond. Sense and respond. So all of them share, you need to sense something and you need to respond to it. However, the order in which we do that is different. And really, since the beginning of industrialization, since the beginning of scientific reductionism, since the beginning of this push towards having everything be very neat, have everything be very orderly, have everything be, this is largely why we see a monoculture in the United States today, why we see huge farms, and why we see mass corporations, and why we have companies like Walmart. It's been this push towards big, so that we can measure and analyze everything. And this is where the complicated and the simple frameworks are where traditional education does a really good job of preparing you for these two. Complex and chaotic, not so much. Complex and chaotic are when we're dealing with emergent or novel things. And what's happening, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more with the next slide, that we're seeing this tremendous shift in how we're doing economic things. So what you're seeing in Silicon Valley right now is what the future economy is going to look like, almost in completion in probably 10 to 15 to 20 to 25 years. Granted, there will still be some manufacturing, but most of it is going to be service-oriented in looking at how we make more efficient use of what we already have and working to innovate on solutions like the massive ecological crisis that we're dealing with. And this is where psychedelics are really interesting. You can go to the next one. And I'm going to say a few things about this. So complex, right? So you saw these on the right side, complex and chaotic. Complex is where the relationship between cause and effect are only clear in retrospect. It's an emergent practice. This is the field that entrepreneurs frequently find themselves in. It's not clear what to do next because you exhausted the expertise you gained through education. The problem is solved instead by testing new solutions and seeing the reaction. Chaotic is the domain where there is no relationship between cause and effect. We must act in spite of the disorder to develop ways to survive. Again, ecological crisis, chaos theory. Nassim Taleb wrote this really good book called Anti-Fragile. This is about being anti-fragile. Times have changed. It's now less valuable than ever to understand how to follow directions and implement best practices. It's the work of understanding and operating in the complex and chaotic systems, entrepreneurship, that's increasingly in demand. And so I think, again, this is when we talk about psychedelics being the bridge to the mainstream. If you have the most influential people, some of the most influential people from an economic perspective, who are using microdosing, I think that's going to do a lot to continue this cultural conversation. We already know that there are billionaires in Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs is probably the most well-known. He's dead now. But in his biography, he made it clear that LSD was one of the most 3 important things that he ever did. Now, Steve Jobs also did a lot of bad shit. I am not saying that he's like this excellent example that we should totally look up to. He had his issues. At the same time, he was one of the most dynamic and creative entrepreneurs and visionaries that we've ever seen as a society. And I think that is typical in Silicon Valley. There are a lot of people who use psychedelics who don't openly talk about it, but they contribute their ability to innovate and succeed on that innovation to these experiences that they've had with mushrooms or LSD or ayahuasca. Tim Ferriss, I've mentioned this name a few times, he was quoted in an article on Forbes saying that without no exceptions, every billionaire he knows in Silicon Valley uses psychedelics on a regular basis. And so again, I think this is why microdosing is so interesting, because it's used by some of the most influential people that we have in society today. And that's, I think, a good thing. Let's keep going. The other thing that I want to emphasize, and this is more from a medical perspective why microdosing is so interesting, is because of something called the consistency principle of persuasion. This is a book. It's called Influence by Robert Cialdini. Robert Cialdini is probably the preeminent social psychologist in today's world, and he wrote this book in the early 80s. And in this book, go to the next one, Mike, is this idea of this commitment consistency principle, which I'll summarize for you and then read this. It's the sense that when people shift their perspective and when they start microdosing, they'll be more willing to try higher doses of psychedelics. In essence, from a social persuasion perspective, social psychology perspective, microdosing makes more people willing or interested to go to higher doses, and I'll explain why that matters in a bit here. So this is kind of a quote from the book. What may occur is a change in the person's feelings about getting involved or taking action. Once he has agreed to a request, his attitude may change. He may become, in his own eyes, the kind of person who does this sort of thing. He's not talking about psychedelics, but we could fill in the blanks there for our own purposes, right? There's always been a very heavy taboo against psychedelic use, unfairly, I think. And microdosing is really making people take a second look at it and saying, hey, this isn't so dangerous, and hey, there are a lot of upsides to it, and hey, the government has been lying to us for a long time. Cannabis has been kind of one really good indicator of that. Same with psychedelics. We've been lied to a lot. Propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. And so I think that's why when microdosing is used, it can be very convincing for people, because commitment then is the key to triggering the rule of consistency. Simply put, if you can get someone to make a commitment, even a seemingly inconsequential one, like microdosing, you automatically trigger the rule of consistency, which can then help trigger the yes response for later and much larger requests. And so why this matters from a medical perspective, this is actually a quote from George Greer, who's the medical director of the Hefter Research Institute. He did an AMA, Ask Me Anything, on Reddit, right after the research came out in early December from Johns Hopkins and NYU about the efficacy of psilocybin in helping with end-of-life anxiety and depression. And this is a quote I picked up from that. And this speaks to the peak experience that people have on high doses of psychedelics. The peak mystical experience that patients experience after taking psilocybin was found to correlate with and mediate the positive therapeutic outcomes. We can't say with 100% certainty how much of the outcomes were due to the psychospiritual effects and how much due to the biological effects of psilocybin, but there's reason to believe that the shift in patients' life perspectives is behind the lasting, and I think that's the most important the most important word is the lasting effects of this therapy treatment. And why that's important goes back to what I mentioned before about microdosing. People, when they start microdosing from a medical context, when they stop, some of these symptoms start to come back. So, for example, they'll start microdosing, they'll do a 10-week session, they'll notice things are great, things are better, I don't have to take my meds anymore, I'm feeling better, I'm more engaged in relationships, and then they'll stop because it's extremely illegal to have these things because they're hard to find, and they'll notice that these things start to come back after time. And as I emphasize with the psychedelics and the heart risk, it's important to be cautious about continuing to do this until we know more. And so this is really important then, because I think what we'll start to notice is that if there is to be a lasting effect from psilocybin, it's going to be at the high dose experience. And again, this is where microdosing acts as this bridge. It helps people become comfortable with the fact that they can take this substance, and that's going to prepare them potentially to do a higher dose experience so they can have this peak mystical experience. So I'm going to wrap up here. And I want to, one last thing that I wanted to say before I get into kind of harm reduction information, is there's this concept called the familiarity principle. And while I think, and I emphasized this earlier in the talk as well, the research that has come out about psychedelics has laid the foundation for what is going now on a cultural level. However, humans are not logical creatures. We don't make a lot of decisions logically, obviously, with, for example, global warming, so we don't make decisions logically or rationally, and so oftentimes to get people to change their mind about something, there has to be an experience that they have to shift their perspective. And oftentimes that experience can be, for example, a friend or family member uses a medicine, they heal, they see that, and word starts to spread. I think what also is really interesting about microdosing, it is that familiarity principle. More people are willing to try psychedelics as a result of microdosing, and I think that's going to do a tremendous job in helping to change the cultural conversation about these substances. And I think it's going to build on what, like I said, that foundation that's already been established with research. And so I just wanted to emphasize that. So, harm reduction information. So, you want to try it. What should you do? A, get the real thing. So, people, they will do, typically for microdosing, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, or they will also try LSD. So make sure that if you're doing it with something that's legitimate. If you're going to try it, get a testing kit. If it's LSD, at least, and make sure that it's the real thing. With mushrooms, these things you can grow in your home if that's what you feel like doing, and so that's a little easier to control, but be careful. 2, clear purpose and intention, as I emphasized before. If you want to go into microdosing, if you want to do this, you should be clear about those intentions and purposes. 3, journal about it, and 4, stick to an extended protocol. And